Welcome everybody to this Fane online event. We're here to talk to Juli Min about her novel Shanghailanders, and that's very exciting. And it's a really wonderful book. I'm not going to give away too much right now, but I want to tell you a little bit about her. She's the editor-in-chief of the Shanghai Literary Review. She was born in Seoul, Korea. She grew up in New Jersey. I believe she's now in Shanghai. Well, she's now in London, but she is living in Shanghai, if I'm correct. She attended the Phillips Academy, Andover, and Harvard, where she studied Russian and comparative literature. Basically, she's a very impressive, very international person, and she has an MFA from Warren Wilson College. So I realize we're not in a room, so we can't have a huge round of applause. So I'm just going to applaud in my room. Thank you so much for being here. Now, you said you could maybe start us off with a short reading to give everyone a little bit of a taste of your writing.
Yes. Thank you so much, Rowan, for being in conversation with me. I love your work. I'm a big fan. And thank you so much to Fane for hosting this online event. So Shanghailanders is a novel about a family living in Shanghai. It starts in 2040 when the mother and father of that family are sort of at a mid-marriage crisis point, and it moves backwards in time to 2014 when they're getting married. So throughout the novel, we see different points of view of the family, the three daughters that they've had and raised, as well as some of the people on the periphery of their household, including their nanny and their driver and grandma. So so I'll read a little bit from the chapter that features their private driver. And this takes place in the near future, but he's remembering sort of when he started driving. I learned how to drive in 2025 when the first self-driving cars were coming onto the market. All the car companies made proclamations. 2025 is the year of the self-driving car, autonomous in 2025. I was 13 and I remember seeing all these statements in the news, feeling the urgency. My time was running out. See, I'd always wanted to drive. It was all those arcade racing games I played growing up. I was the best ranked in our neighborhood. It was the only thing I was ever any good at. I spent a Saturday calling taxis, the cheapest option on all the apps. I made small trips along the Bund until I finally crawled into the back seat of a yellow Shanghai cab, old school. Vinyl seat covers and seat belt buckles pushed deep into the seams, impossible to use. In front, beyond the scratched-up plastic barrier, sat an old man, his hands slack on the wheel, a stick shift. Next to him, a glass thermos of brown water with a layer of malted tea leaves floating on top. Nonghuo, I threw some Shanghai dialect his way. Hello, young man, he said back to me in a downtown city accent, a mild and unhurried voice. He had a full head of white hair. He was wearing dress pants, ironed with sharp creases, a long-sleeved collared shirt. He was the kind of taxi driver I'd been waiting for. I had him take me past the Bund to the other end of Suzhou Creek to the shanty town, one of the last still standing back then. It was where I grew up, where I was born, and where I still sometimes visited our neighbor, Old Man Shi. My parents had been given a new apartment in the city's outskirts in Jiading. The shanty was being razed. It was mostly gone, except for a small section in the corner where Old Man Shi held out in protest. He had no water, no electricity, not even glass on his windows, just a shell of a house with tarped up squares in the winter. Shi parked his scooter under a large tree next to his home. He'd hung a hammock from the tree's low branches, and on sunny days he splayed out on it, shirtless. It was she who used to tell me stories about driving his truck across the country to deliver shipments of fruits and vegetables from one city to the next. He had a pack of trading cards with pictures of race cars on one side and facts about the cars on the other. The raising was at a standstill because of him. The shanty was now, essentially, an open driving course. On our way there, I got to talking to the driver, Master Wang. I asked him how much he made for an hour driving around the city. Then I offered him the same if he'd spend an hour teaching me how to drive. How old are you, kid? I was tall and broad for my age. I told him I was 16. Master Wang took a good look at me in the rearview mirror, hands shifting gears all the while, and nodded. We spent that hour driving loops around the raised neighborhood. We were driving over the Feng's old place, then the Luo's. In the center had been the home of my childhood friend, Ming Yi. He was now a line cook at a Western restaurant downtown. Old man Shi was away that afternoon. We drove circles around his house, and I looked into the empty doorways and windows. I learned quickly. I loved being behind the wheel, controlling the route, seeing and then feeling the texture of the ground, dirt bordered empty concrete foundation running up onto soft patches of grass. I loved the challenge of coordinating my feet and arms, the satisfying pushback of the stick as I shifted between gears. Master Wang was getting ready to retire. I brokered a deal with him. I'd practice, get good, then drive his car all night, fill his gas, and give him 50% of the earnings. It was better than nothing, so he accepted. I was just a kid, a stupid kid in an old night taxi, figuring out my driving style, learning about cars on my own. But no one calling a cheap taxi at 3 in the morning really looks at or questions the age of the driver. They're too drunk, too tired, or too in love to notice.
You. That's a beautiful place to end that reading. And it brings me to a question I was going to ask you later, but I'm going to ask you now, because I was really struck by the fact that although the story does center around this family and most of the all of the chapters are about them in one fashion or another, that you have two chapters, this one and the one about one of their nannies, that are from the point of view of a member outside the family who is also in first person.
Mm.
And in some ways, we're in a more intimate relationship to them because of that, even though they're not the center of the narrative of the whole novel. And I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about the decision to write from their point of view, and B, sort of the decision who you were going to include as lenses we looked at the story through in general.
Yes. So I wanted to kind of look at the city through the lens of its people. And I think one way that, I mean, there's so many ways to do that, but the way that I chose to do that was to focus on a household as a kind of like microcosm of relationships that impact one another. They kind of like feed off of one another, and they build on one another, and they change over time. And they also showcase the incredible social stratification of the city, the incredible diversity of the city. The Yang family that the story centers around is incredibly wealthy, so they're incredibly privileged, they're cosmopolitan, they're mixed race. They speak many languages, and they have like passports to different places and houses across the world. But then they have a local Shanghainese driver, and they have a nanny who's from the northeast of China. And Shanghai is this kind of like melting pot within China, where so many people from different areas of China come to find opportunity and work and kind of like fulfill big city dreams too. And and so it's one way in which I could portray the kind of multifaceted um, dimension of kind of the social aspect of Shanghai life. And then, um, yeah, in terms of first person, I some of these characters don't get recurring uh, chapters. And so I wanted their chapters to be, I think with first person, um, there's an intimacy as you mentioned, but then there's also a kind of there's a voiciness, because you really get the narrative voice. And so I think those two things, kind of the intimacy and the voice, I wanted to give these characters in order to give them, like more resonance, even though they only get one chapter. And I also wanted to kind of showcase their stories, their secrets, their kind of inner life, and show that in all of, as much richness as possible. Because it's, like when you see the whole family and the whole book and the way that the other characters know, but also really don't know, the secrets and the inner lives and the desires and the loves of the people around them. I think it makes that distinction just sort of much, much clearer. The family, I chose they're all really in third person because I feel third person, um, the way that I thought about it was that it kind of created a bubble around them. Um, so the characters are narrating, but then they're also at a bit of a distance. And I think distance is one thing that I wanted to play with the reader, the experience of reading the novel, because the characters are in many ways distant from each other and don't know each other in many essential ways as well.
Thank you. That's a really beautiful answer. I could, you're someone who I think makes such careful choices about structure in your work generally. So sort of a lesson in structure and point of view for anyone who's thinking about that, who wants to read it. I wanted to touch on something that you mentioned very briefly, because I sort of feel like in some ways we're skirting around the family in this moment. We started from the outside and we're going in, just a little appropriate to the book. But you mentioned that they are very wealthy. And I think for a lot of people outside of China, sort of Kevin Kwan and Crazy Rich Asians form this idea of sort of the elite of Asia. And obviously they're in Singapore largely, but he also has characters from mainland China. And his writing about it is very satirical, and it's quite, he's writing about Asian Paris Hilton, kind of, and he's wonderful at doing that. But I feel like despite the fact that you were also writing about a very wealthy family, you're doing something quite different. This family, they're very wealthy, but there's a quietness about them as well. And it felt to me like you were less interested in sort of the wealth for wealth's sake than you were in their sort of the family's journey to get to this particular point. I could be wrong, but that's what I took from it. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that decision to portray not a middle class family, but a family that has a lot by the end. Well, by the end of the time of the book and by the beginning of the book, at the beginning of the book.
Yeah, it's hard to talk about the timeline of the what comes first and what comes last. Yes, I think, yeah, I have to say I love Crazy Rich Asians, and I love what Kevin does, and my family is, in a sense, like in that same kind of social echelon. They go to the same kinds of schools and have access to the same resources. But when it comes to mainland China and I think contemporary Shanghai, there is a way in which, obviously because of history and what's happened in the past century, there was, and ideas of what the elite was and is. And so even though Leo, in terms of his background, he may have come from a wealthy family generations ago, there is a chapter, Leo is the father, there's a chapter in which, he's kind of exploring his past, which, is broken in many different kinds of ways, but he didn't grow up wealthy. No one really in China grew up wealthy in like the 70s and 80s. And everyone was, um, you know, dealing with the hand that history dealt them. And so, and I'm obviously talking about, Cultural Revolution and, um, the dispersion of wealth from the elite to the working classes. And so when we see some of his personal history, we see that, he grew up in the 80s and 90s when there was incredible wealth coming into China, and Shanghai was raised and developed and becoming this incredibly wealthy city that it is today. But it's a very recent phenomenon. And for someone who was born in that generation, um, you know, everyone who grew up in that generation, that new generation post Cultural Revolution, there was this rapid change, which comes with its own kind of trauma, and it comes with its own very complicated ideas for what it means to be wealthy. When you go from like nothing to all of a sudden having so much as Shanghai had. And, the fluctuations of that city alone throughout history are so interesting. But for these characters, for that reason, they don't come from kind of like an old money family. They're all new money in the way that people, in Shanghai, it's all new money. If you stayed in China, and everyone had to start kind of from scratch. So it's so the characters, though, in the end of the time, in time, although they end up becoming very privileged, and they have a lot of wealth, for both the father and the mother, for Leo and Echo, their wealth is something very complicated, and it means something very kind of different for the both of them. Echo, who grew up in Europe, was raised by her mother in like a studio apartment in Paris. And Leo, who grew up in Shanghai, also in like a one bedroom with his parents, and so yeah, I was interested in that kind of complicated, that very complex relationship with money that I think the city still has, that it has today, reflected in those two characters. And then also obviously in the younger generation who grew up with that wealth, like the Yumi, Yoko, and Yukiko, the three daughters of Leo and Echo, who were born in the 2020s and grew up with a totally different version of Shanghai than like Shanghai of the 80s and 90s. So how do they also experience wealth differently? Those were all questions that I wanted to dig into.
Thank you. And I mentioned before we began recording that this book, I was so delighted and pleased and surprised for a very personal reason reading this book, as well as the fact that it's a very good book, which is that obviously this book is called Shanghailanders and set in Shanghai. And so I assumed it would be just about people from Shanghai. And my grandmother was from Shanghai, so that's interesting to me. But she married a Japanese man. Now they lived in New York. Their story is very different from the story in this book. But obviously they have my mother. And I think that often if you say mixed race and you're talking about Asian people, people often assume you're talking about a white person and an Asian person having a baby. Sometimes people think, oh no, actually you could be married to a black person or a Hispanic person. But
Right.
I think very, very often mixed race Asians are overlooked because it's not as obvious just looking at a person that that's their background. I mean, some people might say, oh, I could spot it in this, that, or the other, but it's less obvious. But I think it does still very much affect family dynamics, expectations about certain things. And I was very intrigued by how you portray that in Leo and Echo's marriage, even the detail that the girls are growing up in Shanghai, but they all have Japanese names, and that how that is being successfully or unsuccessfully negotiated in that marriage. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the portrayal of that.
Yeah, Rowan, it's so fascinating throughout my book tour, which, today is the last day of. Um, I've met so many people who have come up to me and said, like, this is me, or this is my life, or I know, like, who knew that there were so many like French, Japanese, like European, you know, Chinese, Japanese growing up in growing up in and being educated in the US. And um of course, I know that they exist. I wrote these characters as a reflection of these ideas, but it's been just incredible to hear people connect to the story on personal levels, because it's a very specific combination of elements and cultures. Um, yeah, the Shanghai is uh, a city of outsiders, really. I mean, it's a city that belongs to Shanghainese, to locals, but it's also historically, it's been a semi-colonial city, and it was, even a refuge um, for for Jews during the Holocaust. It's had this very, very long history um, with foreignness, a kind of like friendliness, welcomeness to outside populations. And then, as I mentioned today, even, a lot of domestic migration within China as well. Um, for for this family, I wanted, I myself have lived in Shanghai as an outsider. I'm a foreigner, I'm an American, I'm a Korean American. And my experience of Shanghai, also married to a local Shanghainese, um, but who lived, he also lived abroad for almost close to 20 years. Um, and so the idea of like who is local, who is a foreigner, um, there are so many shades to that idea. There are locals who go away and study for 20 years and come back. And there are people like me who may look Asian and people may assume are Shanghainese or Chinese, but I'm actually Korean, but then actually I'm American. And then there are my children who are obviously mixed, who are Chinese and Korean. And so ethnically they are Asian, but they speak English at home. And they're fluent in Chinese, and they speak a little Shanghainese. And so you have so many gradations and then of course you have like white foreigners who live in Shanghai still, and who have always been in Shanghai. Um, so for this family, I wanted to capture one essential thing about Shanghai, which is its kind of complicated relationship to foreignness. Um, but I also wanted to make the family completely Asian, because Shanghai is a city in Asia. It's a city that's dominated by Asians. It's a city that's becoming more and more Asian in a sense, as the ebbs and flows of history, um, change and produce change. And so I made the deliberate choice to have like all the major characters in the novel be Asian, because that's something I think also true to the place. I have like a few, foreigners and Americans who come in. And the novel is also set across the world. There's a scene in Lisbon, and there's a scene in Boston, and there's a scene in Paris, and a scene in Kyoto, because of the nature and the backstories of the family. But yeah, I think probably partly my personal experience of being an outsider in Shanghai, influenced the makeup of the family, but also, um, specifically the Japanese and the French have had a very long history, a very long colonial history with the city. And so, making the family Shanghainese, French, and Japanese, I also wanted to kind of reflect some of the ways in which the dynamics of the family kind of reflect some of the history of the city. And you're right, they do navigate it in in interesting ways. At one point they're kind of Leo's thinking about giving certain names to his children, and then in a later chapter you see, oh, like the girls all have Japanese names. And so the reader can kind of see through time, through like the kind of 3 decades of this relationship. Oh, like this person won that argument, or this person won that argument. And yeah, those are some kind of things that I wanted to weave throughout the novel for the reader to figure out and decide upon.
Well, I think that works very, very well. And I think yeah, it's great. And actually the fact that you came back to the 3 decades, the time, I wanted to ask you about that. That was where I was going to start off, but I got sidetracked. Which is, I think, when you first open the book and it's in the future, and that definitely very much strikes the reading. Okay, well, how is Juli Min imagining the future? And I was thinking that for me, I would have been very intimidated to write that, especially the near future, because weirdly, you could write about 1,000 years from now, and who knows? It doesn't matter. But we'll hopefully be around by the time we get to the opening of this book. And I was wondering how you thought about writing the near future, how you thought about what you wanted to include, how you wanted to portray it, basically.
Yeah, 2040. So the book starts in 2040, and mainly what I wanted to do with that move into the future was reflect on the ways in which things change, but also they don't change. What are our readerly expectations for something in the future, and how might that reflect the characters' expectations or ideas of change and time? The book is in many ways about expectations and change. For example, like when you get married, you have expectations of what marriage will be like, and also there's change because in a decades long partnership with someone, they will change, and you know both partners will change. Sometimes they will be pushed to change, and sometimes something essential will stay true and unchanging, for better or for worse, over time. And so I think playing with the idea of what we expect to change or not to change. My future is very similar to the present, um, in many ways. And then there are some kind of like hints at ways in which it's different, but I didn't want to write this kind of crazy sci-fi um future, like um Blade Runner 2040, because I think that's also unrealistic, like um for example, like marriage, like weddings, people put on a white dress and walk down the aisle, and how long has that been happening? There are some things that that do change quickly, and there are some things that maybe should change, and there are some things that don't change. So um yeah, just kind of, I think, just pressing that up against the reader and their expectations for the future, and then um hopefully, you know also like having the characters have to deal with that as well over time.
That's a very good explanation. And I think also, I realize I feel like that was the way I phrased that was kind of mean. Like, I'm going to call you in 2040 and be like, did you get it right? I think, when we're writing fiction, people still read 1984. Did 1984 look anything like 1984? Not really. But was he trying to do particular things that many people felt he did successfully? Though he's a complicated man. Let's not get into the criticisms of George Orwell. But what I'm trying to say is, I think you had a book that felt very truthful about what it means to be a person and exactly what you're talking about what can change and what can't. And I think in the marriage, it's very interesting to see how much pressure is put on Echo to change and how she doesn't really fight back. She's just sort of like a rock that's like, okay, you're gonna make all this noise and I'm gonna keep being Echo. And I thought that was an interesting marriage dynamic that pushes them towards the
Yeah.
change there. Um, but so to stick a little bit with time, you then obviously we begin in the future and then we go back in time. And when I got to the end, I thought, how would I have felt differently about this book if every chapter was reordered the other way? Because I think you could. I mean, by you could, I mean I think one could reverse it and still understand the plot. It's not like, I don't know, a murder mystery where you wouldn't be able to understand it. But I think it might have different emotional resonances. And I wanted to ask you about what made you choose to go backwards in time. Did you ever think you'd go forward in time? Like, yeah, just tell us about it.
Yeah, the backwards. So I'd written, a few character sketches, and pretty early on, I knew that I wanted to go backwards in time. I had the idea for the ending and like some of the lines that happen at towards the end of the ch last chapter, quite clear in my mind pretty early on in before I finished the first draft of the novel. So Um, yeah, and I think that so that because obviously the novel ends on their wedding day, um, there's there's a kind of sweetness, because weddings are sweet, they're lovely, they're beautiful, and they are these expressions and performances of love and their commitments that that two people make publicly. And so they're extremely beautiful and full of hope. And and so I wanted the reader to leave with that note, because I think that whatever happens in a marriage, um, and despite the ways people change over decades, in this case, like a 3-decade long relationship, um, I think that those memories, those like I don't know, those like residual, like fantasies and hopes and naivete of romance and of weddings and of everlasting love and commitment, like a promise that you make to another person. I think that those are everlasting, they in the way that the past never leaves, and the past always is present and moves forward into the future. Um, so it is with a couple who gets married, and so I think there's something beautiful there too, that um, you know, perhaps a family, even despite many difficulties and despite maybe even some essential, misalignments, um, there's a kind of beauty in the romance and the memory of that romance that can maybe sustain a relationship sometimes, but also that can, um, yeah, also reflect on why a family and a couple has stayed together um, over so many years.
I mean, I do think it's a very romantic book in certain ways. Like, even though
Mm.
it shows a lot of the troubles in that family and in that marriage and the miscommunications, I at least still sort of hoped for both of them. And you, you sort of hope that in the future, after the novel, that they find some way back to the beginning in a way. So
Mm.
no, I think you do a a job that's hard to do. I think it's hard to both be realistic about what love is and the difficulties of it while still being romantic. And somehow this you succeeded. Thank you. It is still a romantic book. So
Yeah, I hope so. I hope so. And I remember at some point, an editor asked me, like, how does this person change? Um, how does like one person in the marriage change from the beginning to the end? And I had like very clear ideas of what this meant or what that meant. And they were like, "Oh yeah. Oh, okay, cool. I got it." And I want, even though it may seem like, people don't change, we talked about change over time and expectations. Um, maybe in little ways they also do. And um, that's also something.
yeah, no, it
Yeah.
is. It is. And maybe when I said that Echo doesn't is like a rock, I think she doesn't change in the ways necessarily that Leo wants what thinks he wants her to, but she does change. She definitely does change, but not under order, which I liked
Right.
about her as a character.
Yeah, she's kind of like quiet and may seem a little bit passive, but she's got like a kind of rebelliousness.
Yeah,
Uh,
no, I meant the rock as a compliment. Like, I do
yeah.
think that's a strength, not a passiveness in going no,
Mm.
there isn't. But no,
Yeah.
but they're a good, they're an interesting couple. She seems soft but is strong, and he seems strong and has these little tender spots within him. And I think
Yeah. I think that's a lovely way to put it. Thank you.
thank you for writing them. So actually, it was interesting you mentioned your editor, because one of the questions I wanted to ask you was, you are an editor of a
Mm.
literary magazine, and do you feel that affects your writing? Is it something you just have in two different boxes in your brain, and you put one aside when you're doing the other one? Do you think it shapes you in any way?
Yeah, so I'm not currently doing it now, but I ran the Shanghai Literary Review for about 6, 7 years, and I edited the fiction section. Um, that that work was so incredible. I mean, as an editor, and we always have read submissions, for many years blind. So we would not know, who's submitting, what their background is, what their resume is. And um, being in the position of, you know, like meeting a work on its own terms, on only its terms as a piece of work, and then um choosing it, working on it, or not choosing it, and being clear to myself what my priorities are in terms of, style or craft or whatever. Um, and just looking at a work in different ways. I think that was so helpful for me in terms of um like figuring out what I like and what I admire and what I I mean, of course, I've studied literature for years, so I have always had opinions, but it's one thing to be taught something and to be told that it's good and that it's part of the canon or that it's um, worthwhile. And it's another thing to read completely blind and to judge it, to judge it. And so I think that exercise is something that all writers should do. I think um, and of course, editing, I think was so helpful probably when it came to the novel to, um, yeah, to just be more open and not take things personally and to, you know, in terms of like level of respect for, how much an editor um can see versus how much I could see. Yeah, that was really nice and helpful during the book editing process.
Mhm. That makes sense. I've edited two anthologies, and I think it helps me when I'm being edited in my fiction work to remember that when I'm giving someone edits, it's just because I want it to be better. It's not because I hate
Right.
them.
Right.
And if they come up with something different that isn't my suggestion and it also makes it better, then I'm perfectly happy.
Right.
I'm like remembering that to myself when I'm the author, that is what the editor is trying to do. She's trying to help me. I don't have
Mm,
to do what she says, but I should probably listen to the fact that she's saying something's not working. And like
right.
I'd been told that before because you do get told that by your editors and by your teachers. But I think you're right, experiencing that and being on the other side of it does have a sort of mental health benefit as well as
Yeah.
sort
But it
of.
also, I think on the flip side, and you probably felt this too, um, sometimes I push back and I don't want to take that. And I think, as an editor, I've received pushback and I've also like accepted it. So, um, I'm also as an editor, you want to make it better, but that's just one version of it being better, exactly. And um, sometimes it doesn't even, sometimes it doesn't need to be better because those are just my terms. And if it wants to kind of, we always said with with the magazine that um, we only accept work that we would accept as is because we wouldn't want to accept work with the idea that it would have to be completely reshaped or revised. So we only ever really accepted work that we loved already as it was. And that was also really helpful to just have good work.
That's great advice for anyone thinking about starting a magazine. So for my very last question, I was wondering if there's anybody in the audience who is thinking about writing their debut novel other than become an editor. Do you have any advice for them starting out before it's published when they're still in their manuscript?
I would say, gosh, I would say that um, it's important to have fun, like um, I think it's important to enjoy what you're working on and to have fun and to play with it. Um, I think that, my 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 best work comes when I'm really enjoying writing it. Um, and I think there's a kind of energy that happens when a writer is really um yeah, like enjoying the something. I mean, not to say that it's not hard, but um yeah, that's actually horrible advice. But I
I
would
know what you mean. Sometimes I teach and I have students who are like, well, what does the market want? And I think
mm,
it's not that you should never ask that question, but I do have to tell them you could be this for years and years of your life. So it also has to be something you want, something that makes you
right,
excited and your brain light up, even if not in every moment, not even if like in,
right.
but that at some point you have to have
Yeah,
fun, as you said.
right. And yeah, so I think that's important. And I'll give another piece of advice because I think that's a little bit tough. Have fun. I think it's, when you're when you're at the point where you're editing a manuscript, um, I would say look around for like the reader that you trust. Um, and also protect yourself, if there's a reader that you think you don't want their advice, then it's also okay to not show it. And it's okay to show it to a smaller group of people. You kind of you should know what you need, and in terms of help. And when you finally do query agents and go out and you look for your um, like partner, your business and editorial partner for potentially for life. Um, yeah, like the most important thing is that they see you and your intentions very clearly, and they read your work and meet it on its own terms, and um, they get it. Yeah.
No, that is very good advice, because I think it sort of like romantic relationships, there can be a temptation for the first person who likes you to go, "Oh, somebody liked me." And it
That's
is
right.
important to think, like, do I like them? Is this
Yes.
something I want for me?
Right.
So
And do they like me for me, or do they like
yeah,
me for, not me?
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Do they want to change me too much?
Yes.
Oh,
Exactly.
okay. So with that, I will let us wrap up. But thank you so much for making the time to talk to us and the Fane audience. Your book is available in hardback in all good bookshops, I'm sure, and also available for order online. And anyone listening, I think it's a really fun book. It's a really beautiful book. It talks about some serious things like we mentioned, but it's a drama as well, and there are secrets, and that's fun. Secrets are always fun. So go out, buy Julie's book. Thank you for watching this Fane online event.
Thank you so
Bye
much, Marilyn.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.